Okay, class, welcome to the approaches and slash perspectives in psychology presentation. Where you should take the majority of these notes is on the white chart that was handed out in class. I would suggest you take very detailed notes. This is a topic that we will be talking about for the remainder of the year. So it is titled Perspectives in Psychology. Oftentimes it could also known as the approaches to psychology. A lot of the following perspectives are psychologists' attempts to explain and predict behavior in the mental process. A lot of psychologists don't want to pinpoint one perspective way on how to describe somebody's behavior, like it's purely the brain's fault for the reason why somebody's behaving this way. It might also be the behavior of the individual. So this is what it's looking at more in depth. I will talk about in class. It all started with structuralism and functionalism. Those were the two big known as schools of thought. Schools of thought were essentially perspectives. They weren't little houses or places that we go on a daily basis. It was like a school of thought was like a big idea that many people followed. Today, again, it is known as approaches or perspectives in psychology. Most of this information is found in your Myers textbook on page 8 and 11, and there is a great chart on page 11 as well. Again, I really want you to fill in the chart that I handed out in class. Psychology for a long time has been on this big debate over, is it nature's fault or is it nurture's fault that really cause the individual to act a certain way. So controversy over whether human traits and behaviors are based on biology. So the reason why, let's say, Miss Gavin got depression, was it because of something that is in her brain chemistry, hence why she maybe has a sad attitude? Or is it more based on she grew up in a really, let's say, a household that was pretty violent and sad and there wasn't a lot of money and it was very impoverished? Is that the reason why maybe Miss Gavin is her cause for depression? Some of the big topics you can look at with nurture versus nature is what causes depression. Intelligence, is it something that you're born? It's the nature in which you're born with a lot of genes that allow you to be smart, or is it something more nurtured? Your parents were reading to you when you were young, you've gone to excellent schools, and hence that's why maybe you're so intelligent. People question serial killers. Serial killers, is it something that they're born with, the genes? They have just like this bad gene that's going to cause them to be really violent and negative? Or do they grow up in households, again, that their parents were serial killers, or they watched a lot of violent shows that cause them to be that way? And another topic you can talk about is personality, and the list can go on and on and on. So many psychologists nowadays take on the eclectic approach. Most psychologists today use this approach when they're describing different behaviors. It is a vocab term you do need to know. It's using more than one, if you want to call it, approach, perspective, or branch to explain certain people's behavior. They don't just blame it on, oh, it's the biological approach that they're acting this way. A lot of psychologists say, yeah, some of it might be influenced by your biology, but others might say, hey, it has to do something with your thought process, and I think it also is the neighborhood in which you grew up in. So the way that we're going to look at these, it's known as the biopsychosocial approach, and we're going to come back to that. Some of it might have to do with your biology, and I would highly recommend you copy this chart down somewhere. I know there's not a ton of room on the paper that I gave you, but maybe make sure it is in your notes. The biological perspective is something that maybe it's your genes, you're genetically predisposed to this. We were going to talk a little bit about natural selection. It could be more on the psychological, and psychological has to do with mostly your thought process, maybe your emotional response to something, your cognitive response to something. And then you have your last one, which is the sociocultural perspective. This is your family, your friends, and how they've influenced your behavior. And again, we will come back to this chart, but make sure you have it copied down somewhere. So breaking apart the biopsychosocial approach, there are 3 different approaches that we will go through. First approach, the neurobiological perspective, otherwise known as the biological perspective. I would make sure maybe this entire across your chart where you're going to fill in the biological perspective right under approach. And make sure you maybe shade this area in yellow. That'll help you kind of remember which approach falls under the biopsychosocial model as we go through them in the remainder of the year. But what this approach basically looks at is more the nature perspective. It tries to seek links between the events in the brain and the mental process. What particularly is going on in this brain here that's causing your behavior? Well, let's say if you got hit in the back of the head here, and we'll talk more in detail on this on class, but if you got hit in the back of the head here, and all of a sudden you're having issues seeing, well, clearly that's where your occipital lobe, that's where your sight is processed. It looks at things such as your nervous system, hormones, your genes, and it looks at, like I said, in depth in the brain. In your key words or key terms column, I would make sure you get to know, you familiarize yourself with these terms that link with each approach. This one, neurons, okay, brain, and the nervous system are some big key terms that maybe you are familiarizing yourself with. And then people, we will talk about. Sperry is a very popular person when we get to brain research. He was somebody who has done a lot of research on the brain. Person or another, I would say, approach at this point in time we're going to talk about is the evolutionary perspective. And you've probably heard about the evolutionary perspective when you were little, studying science classes. This is nothing new. Charles Darwin, okay. They focus on factors such as natural selection, adaptation, and evolution of behavioral patterns. Some behavioral patterns maybe have been passed down generation to generation to keep those people alive. It takes into consideration both genetic and environmental factors. Behaviors that cause positive things to happen are repeated, and we develop genes from them. So we will talk a little bit about that. Key figures you need to know is Charles Darwin. And then again, keywords you want to add in your chart is survival, adapt, natural selection. Again, I would, in this column, cross it. When you're writing this in, I would maybe take a highlighter and highlight this whole section yellow. So again, you can remember that this has something to do with the biological perspective because it's looking at your genes, it's looking at particularly your body, how that's affecting your behavior. Okay, and the last one under the bio section would be behavioral genetics, and this is a more current approach to psychology. This one, it's looking at your genes. It focuses on how our genes and the environment influence our individual differences. So what genes have been passed down, particularly from my family line, that are going to impact my behavior, my attitude, my personality. Some things to look at is they're looking at heredity and genetic predispositions. They're looking at keywords you should consider here are genes. So the question maybe to consider is, how is behavioral genetics different from the biological or neurobiological perspective, the first one we wrote down? Well, this one's looking at more particularly the genes. The neurobiological perspective, also called the biological perspective, is looking particularly just at the brain. Okay, this one's looking at specifically the genes. So those are all the biological perspectives. Moving on to things that you may see in the psychological perspectives. There's 3 psychological perspectives that maybe you want to highlight or shade in this entire row red. It's the first one we're going to look at is the psychodynamic perspective, also maybe sometimes considered the psychoanalytical perspective. This one came about in 1895. The person who was responsible for developing this perspective is Sigmund Freud. What he really wanted to focus on problems that occur in a person's childhood and see how those issues affect a person throughout their life. So what really happened in your childhood, maybe that causes you to not so much even recognize it, but it definitely influences who you are as a person. So again, that's Sigmund Freud, somebody we will study in depth. He really looks at a big word that you want to probably know for this one, is focuses on our unconscious motives. And those unconscious motives influence our daily things. So things that we're not always aware of, it's unconscious, but they still drive us to do certain things. He came up with this iceberg theory, which we will go through in depth at a later point in time, but that's something kind of to connect with this approach. And again, his name is Sigmund Freud, and keywords to consider are unconscious repression childhood. So let me give you an example of this perspective. Let's say when I was little, I grew up with an older sister, and my older sister got a lot of attention, and maybe my parents favored her. I thought they favored her in one way or another. Well, my childhood, that's something that I constantly remember and think about. And hey, that's unfair. And I have these kind of unresolved conflicts of this childhood experience. So maybe when I get older, I decide maybe I just want to have one child, or I want to have 7 or 8 different kids because I want to make sure that they have other siblings to talk to, because it was just me and my sister, and I felt like maybe the relationship, they favored her, and maybe I didn't really feel like I fit in. So I'm not consciously thinking about this all the time, okay? But if I sat back and actually kind of talked to somebody about this, I obviously would be conscious about it. But it definitely does impact my daily behavior of how I'm going to maybe raise my kids. Another example of this could be, let's say, when you were little, your childhood, you were raised in a household with lots of fighting, and your parents you ended up getting a divorce. And so now you repress it, and it's all the way at the bottom of the iceberg, and you don't think about it all the time. Maybe you never think about it at all because it's so painful. But when you get older and you grow up, you start realizing you can't stay in a steady relationship, and you don't like being in relationships, or you never want to particularly get married. Well, if you stop and think about it, if we're thinking under Freud's beliefs, he believed that probably that pain that was down at the bottom of the iceberg really impacts your daily actions, really kind of influence whether or not you want to behave or get married when you are older. Again, there's many situations that we will look at like this, and this is Sigmund Freud's belief. It's not the do-all, end-all, but that's kind of the psychodynamic perspective. Another one that falls under the psychodynamic perspective is cognitive perspective. This one focuses on how people mentally represent the world and consciously try to understand it, the mental process of it, the language and perception of it. This one really focuses on the mind and how we particularly think. So let's say we have an issue where a small child ends up stealing something, and people are very upset with the young child, stole something. Well, the cognitive perspective, maybe the child stole because he didn't even know he was stealing. He wasn't able to understand right from wrong at this point in time because he is so little. All right. Again, we will look at more details with the cognitive perspective, but some key terms with this one is thinking, processing, storing, memory has to influence why we choose to do certain things. Humanistic perspective, a very positive perspective. It was in the 1960s. At that point in time, a lot of people were peace and love, and maybe it's not people don't act because of their unconscious thoughts. Maybe people act because they have goals set for themselves, and if they don't have a goal, then maybe they won't move forward and act positively. This perspective is people have the right to free will. They have the right to make their own choices in life. Many of the decisions that people make they're trying to self-fulfill themselves and trying to make themselves better. This one focuses on how our choices shape who we become, and we look for the meaning of life. So let me give you an example here. What the humanistic perspective would be is if I had a group of freshmen, all different freshmen, and the humanistic perspective says that anybody can do anything if they put their mind to it. So if I had all my freshmen decide to set goals, and most of them, let's say some of them wanted to get an A in this class and a B in that class, but 5 of my freshmen didn't want to set goals. They didn't see much worth in it. They decided that they never were going to go to college, or they never were going to graduate high school. Well, their behavior might not be so positive because they don't have any goal set for them in the future, which might influence their behavior. Humanistic perspective says everybody has the right to be positive and to make successful changes in their life if they have goals set. And I believe that that's important. If you have a goal set, you're more prone to be a more positive person. Key figures with this that we'll look for is Carl Rogers is somebody. The way I remember it is Mr. Rogers was so happy. So Carl Rogers is somebody who promoted this one. And then Abraham Maslow, if you ever heard of the hierarchy of needs, that is something that we will be taking a more in-depth look at in class. Keywords to consider: growth, human potential, and success. Again, I would shade these three areas: the humanistic perspective, the cognitive perspective, and the humanistic perspective, all under the psychological perspective and the biopsychosocial. They're all red. They all the way this whole approach deals with the way that we think about a certain situation. And the last two in your chart is the sociocultural perspective. Okay, the first one is behaviorism. It's going to be one of the first approaches. I would maybe highlight this section in green. Behaviorism, otherwise known as the learning perspective. This perspective really looks at our particular experiences, and our experiences reinforce our behavior and how we're going to act down the road. So it says unique experiences and reinforcement guide patterns of development and behavior. It focuses on how our environment shapes who we become. Okay? It argues against that free will. So true behaviors feel that we are products of our environment and argue against free will. It doesn't matter what goals you have set. If you've learned a certain thing, you're more prone to do it. The one that I always give an example here would be, it's kind of like John Locke and the blank slate, thinking about that aspect of it. I learned maybe as a child that every single time I did homework, I never got points for it. I never got complimented. I never got any grades for it. It never affected my grade. So in general, I'm going to stop doing homework because it doesn't have any effect on me. Or maybe when I was little, I remember holding my hand over a fire. And it was my first birthday, and I almost touched that fire. And my grandpa, I have a video of my grandpa slapping my hand out of the fire. Well, I learned that fire was bad, so now I'm not going to touch it. Another example could be that a little kid in the store, standing at the checkout line, and his mom, and he goes, "Mom, I want the candy." And the mom says no. He keeps going, "I want the candy, I want the candy, I want the candy." Well, what does the mom do? The mom gives him the candy. So the next time the little kid is in the checkout line, what is the little kid going to want? He's going to want the candy. And that's rewarding or shaping your behavior. You're shaping those actions a lot of times based off of punishments, or it could be reinforcements. Watson is somebody that we will study in this section. Skinner is very famous. We also have Thorndike, somebody that we'll look at, and Ivan Pavlov, if you've taken psychology before. He's very famous for the dog experiment. Keywords to consider here is experience, learned, or reward. This one really deals with your personal experiences. And then last but not least is the sociocultural perspective. Your culture really influences who you are. Individual differences are created by your sociocultural factors. Okay, it focuses on maybe your ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic status, and how that influences your behavior. Somebody very famous is Zimbardo that studied sociocultural perspective, and things to consider are your culture, your society, your peers. Here at Leiden, we're very positive in club involvement. We're very positive in sport involvement. And so you're now, you're fostered in somewhere that's a happy, positive place that you want to be a part of. Maybe other schools don't foster all the clubs, and so maybe you would never be interested in joining a club particularly. This is more influencing your particular culture and how that behavior. So again, we've kind of talked about the 8 different approaches you do need to go in class. They do fall under this biopsychosocial approach that not just one perspective influences your behavior, maybe 8 different perspectives influence your behavior. You got the bio perspective that you guys did in yellow, the neurobiological perspective, also known as the biological perspective. You got the behavioral genetic, which is your genes, and then lastly you got evolutionary. All these deal with the bio of an individual. You then have the psychological perspective. And I believe you did this one in red. Psychological perspective has to do with your unrepressed thoughts as childhood. You get the humanistic, the positive, you can be a better person. Then lastly, you have the cognitive perspective. Cognitive perspective is your thought process and how that is going to influence you down the road. All of these has to do with thinking and your mindset. And then the last one, sociocultural, is more your environment. Sociocultural perspective, how is your particular culture influencing you? Behavioral, how is your past experiences influencing your behavior? And these two, maybe in your columns, were in green. So make sure that you have 8 different rows, okay, and 8 of these perspectives are filled in. I would make sure you're able to connect the key terms to each of the different perspectives. And I know if you have flipped through your packet, you also noticed that you have a great chart on page 33. You take a look at it with additional key terms that will help you remember each of the different approaches. And I will see you in class.